hypothesis. Now, you then um, think about how you can capture data to answer that specific hypothesis, right? So that's the hypothesis-driven approach to research. As you can imagine, that is a bit more laborious in terms of input. You have to, possibly go and collect primary data. You have to get collaborators and funding, and you have to worry about how am I going to sponsor this idea, right? But ultimately, it's in terms of the trade-offs, it's great because it gives you a very tailor-fitted answer to the question you were trying to answer in the first place. The second option is the data-driven approach, where in this case, you're not starting with a hypothesis per se. You start with the data set, right? You pick a data set and say, let me go through this data set and let's see what has not been done, or what if there's anything interesting in here, right? So you could pick a data set like Haynes or GYTS or GATT, right? And you go through the data sets, look at the variables, and you're like, oh, okay, this is quite interesting. So your inspiration is drawn from the data that exists and cross-mapping that with what already has been done and what has not been done. Now, if you want to build your publication track record and publish faster, obviously, you will need to incorporate a data-driven approach as part of your strategy for output. But the truth lies somewhere in between. A good researcher should have a mix of hypothesis-driven approaches, but also data-driven. Especially if you're early career, you really, really want to explore data sets. And that's because there is just so much data out there that you don't have to wait and say, oh, I want to look for funding to collect data. Because the reality is that no matter how much data you collect, the quality of the data cannot or rarely will come close to the quality of data we already have in large publicly available data sets. So you definitely want to explore this. If you have never published a paper with existing data, oh, you're missing out, right? So you really want to see how you can explore. And so that's part of the things we'll be discussing today. So the question then is, how do you come up with a good research question? Or if you can rephrase that question, what are some of the elements, what makes a good research question and what makes a bad research question? I think it's more interesting to answer the first part of the question, which is what makes a bad question? Because the whole idea is that we should identify elements of what is bad, so that next time you're tempted to come up with or to frame your research question in a bad manner, hopefully you remember this session and revert course. So we're going to see what makes a bad question, why or in what context would we say that a research question is framed poorly. So let us look at 6 identifying elements of bad research questions. So we'll look at these 6 and see, hopefully we can draw lessons from that. The first element we're going to talk about is a fuzzy question. A fuzzy research question, like the image here shows, you can see that these are question marks, but you can't see the sharp outlines because it's kind of very blurred out. The same thing applies with research questions that are not very well defined. Let's take an example. What is the impact of tobacco influences on youth reactions? Now, this question is a fuzzy question because it lacks clarity, right? You might ask, what, for example, in this context, when you say impact of tobacco influences, what does that mean exactly? Tobacco influences could mean anything under the sun. It could mean, for example, exposure to tobacco ads. It could mean exposure to parental smoking or to peer smoking. It could mean anything. So this is very, very poorly defined, tobacco influences. And then the other part of the question is youth reactions. What does that actually mean? Are you referring to behavioral reactions, or are you referring to cognitive reactions? Are you talking about susceptibility, or are you talking about smoking, or what does that mean exactly? Right. And then in terms of youth, what youth are you referring to? Are the youth in Ghana, youth in the United States? So the question lacks elements. So when your research question does not have the details that we need to evaluate it properly, we say your research question is fuzzy or is poorly defined. So the question is, how do we correct this problem? It's not enough to just know that this is bad. We need to be able to correct that problem. Well, we can do so with the PICO framework, or PICOTS as it's expanded. PICOTS is a framework which we use a lot in different kinds of research, from interventional studies to systematic reviews. But the bottom line is that it gives us a framework or a lens through which we can frame research questions properly. The acronym is Population Intervention, Comparison, Outcome, Time, and Study Design. Now, bear in mind that PICO was developed originally for interventional studies. Interventional studies simply mean experiments. And so some elements of PICO may not necessarily apply in the context of observational studies, right? So for example, you might not have an intervention or you might not have a comparison in the descriptive analysis, but that's fine. Just remove the elements that are not relevant, but make sure that every other element that is relevant appears in your research question. So let's play with this. Let's take this PICO framework and let's apply it to that previous question, which was poorly defined, and let us see how it turns out to be. All right, so let's correct that question. So again, remember this was the original question. What is the impact of tobacco influences on youth reactions? If we apply the PICO framework, then the question could read something like this. What is the association between exposure to tobacco advertisements and cigarette smoking susceptibility among a cross-section of tobacco-naive Ghanaian adolescents aged 13 to 15 years during 2017? Now, is this a mouthful? Yes, it is. But it's good to have to be a mouthful, right? Because it then answers all the specific elements that we need. So let's break it apart and let's see how the various elements of PICO or PICOTS fit into this new question. So here, the P in PICO is population, and here we can see that that's very clearly identified. Tobacco-naive Ghanaian adolescents aged 13 to 15 years old. Epidemiology is all about the science of person, place, and time, right? So whatever you're doing in epidemiology, right? Epidemiology is the father of research, at least population level research, right? So epidemiology as a field gets to set the terms for how research should be done. So again, remember that we are always very focused on elements of person, place, and time. Your research question should have those elements, whether it's descriptive, whether it's analytical. Always remember elements of person, place, and time. So population captures the elements of person, like who are we referring to? It's tobacco-naive Ghanaian adolescents, age 13 to 15 years old. The exposure here is referring to tobacco advertisements. And again, that may not be necessarily applicable to your study if your study is just a descriptive study, but if it does apply, definitely specified. The outcome here is cigarette smoking susceptibility. It's not just saying youth reactions, right? It has added some specificity to the whole description. The time is 2017, and the study design is cross-sectional. So now we can see that this is a very well-defined research question that has all the elements of PICO embedded into it. So this is good. Now, let us look at the next issue or next problematic question. In this case, this is what we call the no question question. So here, somebody is answering something, but you're asking yourself, but what question are you answering? As an editor, you find this quite often. You read through a page and you're like, okay, this is interesting, but what is the question? So a no question question is research that there is no question posed, that you're seeing answers. So it begins to look like an essay. When we're small in school, they'll say, oh, write an essay about your favorite meal or your favorite trip. And you start writing all the stories, right? But research is not an essay. Research is about answering a question. So when you're writing and it just feels like an essay, you are doing it wrong because you're not answering a question, right? So you need to be able to frame a research question. And the hallmark of a question is every question must end in a question mark. If your research question does not end in a question, it's not a question, it's not a research question, it's not a question, period. There's a reason why we call it a research question. We didn't call it a research statement, right? There's another term called, gap or, whatever the other contexts apply. But when it comes to a research question, we call it a question because we expect that it will end in a question mark. So if it doesn't end in a question mark, it's not a question. So this is not a question because it does not end in a question mark. This just says anti-smoking campaigns and advocacy in South Africa. So if we want to correct this bad thing, well, we have to find a way of adding a question mark to the end. And the reason why you should make sure your research questions end in a question mark is purely for clarity to yourself. You, first of all, need to know what you're answering, because if you don't even know what the question is, then how are the rest of us supposed to know what what you are answering, right? So that's very important. So let's take this question here and let's reframe it properly so that it is an actual question, not just a statement. So this question now reads, what are prevalence and socio-demographic characteristics associated with exposure to community anti-smoking campaigns among a nationally representative sample of South African youth aged 13 to 15 years who were surveyed during 2017? So as you can see, this now ends the question mark. It frames the question or the whole exercise as something that is investigative. Research is about investigating. For your work to be research, it must meet two criteria. One, it must seek to, the intention must be to contribute to new knowledge. That's number one. And number two, it must be systematic in nature. If those two criteria are not met, then what you're doing is not research, right? So if you're just collecting data, as let's say, administrative data, this is just part of a job. Every morning you go collect the data, maybe patients come in, what's your name, what's your age? The intent is not to collect or to provide new knowledge. The intent is just to do administrative tasks. So the mere collection of data doesn't translate into research. Like I said, those two benchmarks must be present. There must be an intent. So intent means something in your head, right? There must be that intent to create new knowledge, and it must be systematic. So it doesn't matter whether you have an intention to create knowledge. If the whole process is not systematic, then it's not research, right? So we have to think of it that way. So that is why we say questions but end in the question mark, because that is what shows that there is an intention to create new knowledge. All right, let's look at the next three items, which is the opposite of what we discussed last. In second instance, there was no question. In this time around, there are too many questions. This is what we call the TMQ question. I'm sure you've heard of TMI, too much information. Well, this is a spin-off on that, where we're talking about too many questions. Let's look at an example. This says, how has South African youth's exposure to pro-tobacco advertisements changed over time during 2000 to 2020? And what is the association between advertisement exposure and current cigarette smoking overall youth population, as well as cigarette smoking susceptibility among never cigarette smokers? That is a lot to comprehend, right? The problem with having questions that are just a maze of questions is that it's not clear, right? It's not clear, and even if it were clear, nobody has the patience or time to read an 8,000 worded manuscript. We live in an era where people just read tweets and short messages. When you have a paper that becomes so convoluted and so complicated, nobody's going to read it. And the whole point of doing research is to share our knowledge or our investigative findings with the world. So the whole idea should be one question, one manuscript. It shouldn't be two questions or three questions, one manuscript. Have one well-defined research question and one manuscript. So the cure for a TMQ is, well, we're going to split it apart into different questions such that each cogent question becomes a manuscript of its own. So in this case, for example, we have split it into two separate questions. The first one, the Q1 now reads, how did prevalence of exposure to pro-tobacco advertisements in different media change during 2000 to 2020 among South African youths aged 13 to 15 years using repeated nationally representative cross-sectional surveys? You can see that that first question is focusing on one distinct idea, which is trends over time. And that's fine. So we're looking at how did trends change over time. Then the second part is now looking at association between exposure and smoking susceptibility, right? So this is how we solve that problem of TMQ, right? We take that complex question and we split it into distinct parts. The next part is the unanswerable question. Now, if you ask the question, obviously the intent should be that you're going to answer that question. It doesn't do anybody any good if you ask a question that can't be answered, right? That defeats the whole purpose of research. Now, the tricky thing about this unanswerable question is that it doesn't mean that that question cannot be answered by anyone. No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that you, with the data you have at this point, cannot answer that question, at least not with the data you have at all. So The cardinal rule of data or data analysis is don't ask of a data what the data cannot answer, right? And so you need to ask yourself two questions at the beginning of every analysis. One, are the data fit for use? And number two, are the data fit for purpose? Fitness for use simply means, can we use this data for anything good? Data are obviously not fit for use if they have significant issues. If you have massive amounts of missing data, if you have data that is so old, especially for issues of social or behavioral research, we want data to reflect current reality. Obviously, if you have data that is fabricated, that is not fit for use. Now, fitness for purpose is more nuanced because it acknowledges that data might be fit for some purposes, but not fit for other purposes, right? So, but those two questions I think we need to ask ourselves all the time. So it's better not to have a paper written on a project based on data that is so poor than to just publish it and then just later have to worry about errata or retractions, right? And there's just the point I'm trying to make is that there's so much good data in the world that you really shouldn't be focusing on wasting your effort so much on very, very poor data that is not fit for use. So let's look at a question that could be unanswerable in certain contexts. This question says, what is the effect of e-cigarette use on cigarette smoking initiation among Congolese youth aged 13 to 15 years in the 2020 GYTS? Now, the problem with this question is a problem of framing and epidemiology, right? The authors here are trying to use cross-sectional survey, global youth tobacco survey. But the question they're asking of that data is a question the data cannot answer. They're asking of the data causal effect, right? So in epidemiology, there are certain words that are so heavy that we try not to use them very casually. Words like effect, words like impact, words like cause, words like attributable. Those are all words that suggest or infer causality, right? One of the very first things you will have learned in Epi 101 is that association is not cause. There are certain data that we cannot make inferences about causality from. For example, cross-sectional data. And that is because in cross-sectional data, we are collecting data on the exposures and the outcomes at the same time, right? To make any kind of inferences about causality, one of the very key elements we need is temporality. Temporality simply means that we collect data on the exposure, and then we watch and see whether that exposure is associated with outcome downstream, right? This is the issue of the chicken and the egg. Like, did the chicken come before the egg, or did the egg come before the chicken? Well, in a cross-sectional survey, we do not know because both exposure and the outcomes were collected at the exact same time. So the only thing you can do with cross-sectional data is explore associations. So you can say that A is associated with B. But remember that associations are reciprocal, which means that if A is associated with B, that means that B is also associated with A. So you can think of associations as a two-lane road, a two-lane street. Causality, however, is a one-lane road. A is causally related with B, or A causes B does not mean that B causes A, right? So one is a two-way lane, the other one is a one-way lane. So what makes this question bad from an epidemiological perspective, or just purist research perspective, is trying to ask of the data things that the data cannot answer. So the solution here is simple. We simply reframe the research question to be something that the data can answer. So in this case, for example, we simply remove the word effects, which is the offensive word there. And we replace it with the word associations, because like we said, associations are reciprocal. A is associated with B means that B is also associated with A. And that solves the problem. Because in this first context, there was no way that that data could answer that question. But this time around, it can answer that question. So I've used a simplistic example to illustrate how framing also matters a lot in research and why it's very important for us to frame our research questions the right way. Now, the recycled question is the fifth question type that is a problem. Now, there are two types of recycling in research. One is repeating yourself. The other is repeating others. When you repeat yourself, we call that salami slicing. As a journal editor, one of the things that we really find concerning is when authors salami slice. Salami slicing means that you take a research idea. Now, instead of you publishing that wholesome idea in one paper, you slice it into tiny pieces. So let's take an example. This investigator has found that maybe they're trying to look at the relationship between tobacco use and tooth loss. Now, instead of them to publish this whole idea in one paper and let's say look at the relationship between tobacco and tooth loss and perhaps explore whether there is effect modification by tobacco product type. In other words, is the relationship between tobacco and tooth loss different for the different types of tobacco products? For example, is it different for cigarettes and cigars and smokeless tobacco? Now that will make for more interesting reading because it shows that that paper has really explored length and depth of the topic. So what does this gentleman or this researcher do? No, they decide that they want to have 10 papers from this idea instead of one solid paper. So they say, oh, what paper number 1? What's the relationship between cigarette smoking and tooth loss? Then what's the relationship between cigar smoking and tooth loss? And this is what they now repeat for all the other tobacco product types. Of course, they're going to see consistent relationships, right? So it's the effort to, I guess it's driven by publish or perish culture. But that is not ethical in terms of science, publication ethics. You don't want to repeat yourself. If there is a grand idea, you want to publish it in one wholesome, lump so that researchers can access that. Now, repeating others is what we call confirmatory research. Now, there's nothing bad per se in confirmatory research. It's just that it's going to be very hard for you to publish it. So if it all boils down to issues of efficiency and opportunity costs. In economics, opportunity cost simply means the time you're spending doing A means that you don't have time to do B, right? Everything comes at a cost. And so it's journals generally want to advance or to grow their journal. As a journal editor, my primary role is to help the journal grow. And how do you help the journal grow? Well, you expand the geographic readership of a journal. That's one. Number 2, you advance you make sure the journal publishes contemporary things that are on everybody's mind. You want your journal to be the medium for fierce debates and discussions, right? You're not going to have any of those things by publishing stale material, right? Something that we all know, like nobody has interest in that. So you always have to look at things from the editor's perspective. Sure, you want to publish your paper, but your own priorities to publish that paper, but your priorities have to somehow, at some point, align with the priorities of the editor-in-chief, right? That's where you have a win-win because it's the best thing that will happen is making sure that those interests are aligned. You have a great idea you want to publish, the editor thinks that's a great paper. Oh, you have all aligned on that point, and that's a winner. That's a win-win, right? So that's why confirmatory research is it's not so appealing. It's just from the perspective of you're going to struggle a lot with publishing that. So you want to look at the gap. The good news is that there is always a gap, right? There's always a gap, and the way you can always find gap is to look at it through two frameworks. One, you can look at vertical knowledge gaps or horizontal knowledge gaps. So vertical knowledge gap simply describes the step-by-step process on which knowledge builds on each other, right? So we start from basic knowledge, which is just, basic scientific discovery. We don't care about applications. We don't care about how we're going to use that knowledge. It's knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That's what basic knowledge is. And then we build on that. For example, we come to theoretical knowledge where we'll say, how does this work in animal models? And then on theoretical knowledge, we build and create efficacy knowledge. We can, for example, conduct confirmatory clinical trials and say, how does this intervention work in a controlled environment? And then from efficacy knowledge, we come to real-world evidence. Real-world evidence is simply saying, how does this intervention, whatever it is, how does it work in the real world, not in a controlled setting, right? So the idea here is that building on vertical knowledge gaps mean that you can say, oh, we know this from basic knowledge, but we don't have this information from a theoretical perspective, or we know that this intervention works in clinical trials, but no study has evaluated it in the real world, right? So those are legitimate ways you can frame gaps in knowledge that are relevant and that actually make sense to push the field forward. So this is one way you can do that. Another aspect of it is to look at horizontal knowledge gaps, where in this case you're looking at the same plane. So here, previously we're looking at from cells to animals to humans to groups of humans. Here you're just looking at the same population horizontally, and you're saying what gaps exist on this horizontal plane. And one way to do that is to use the interrogative pronouns: what, where, when, who, and how. So with those interrogative pronouns, you can almost always create a gap in knowledge. Research is all about showmanship. It's not enough to just fill the gap in knowledge. You have to, first of all, tell us what the gap is eloquently, and then you can proceed to fill the gap, right? So that's your job as a writer. Your job, especially in the introduction, is to be a salesman. You're a salesman, and what you're selling is your idea. The editor-in-chief is the person trying to buy, the person you're trying to pitch the idea to. So as an editor, you're trying to sell your idea, your paper to me and make me want to buy it. So you really, really have to be convincing. And so this is how you can frame it. You can declare how gaps exist. What means we have data for that, but not this, right? In terms of the outcome. Where it's talking about the population, we have data for it has been done in that population, but not here, right? So, in research on, for example, e-cigarettes or whatever it is, you can say, for example, most data we have on this is in the developed world. We don't have data in, let's say, in developing countries. Now, the trick here is it is not enough for you to just tell us that we have data for there, but not here. The trick is establishing why we expect for differences to exist. That's the crux of the argument that you must establish. So it's not enough to say, oh, we have data in the developed countries, but not in the developing world. All right, so that is not interesting enough. Why do we expect that differences will exist between those two populations? That's the crux of the argument that you have to clearly lay out. The same thing applies to using when as an interrogative pronoun. If you say we have data from 2010, but not 2020, it begs the question of why? Like, why do you expect that there will be differences between 2010 and 2020? So you're just saying that we have data then, but not now is an incomplete statement. You have to complete the statement by providing a rationale for why we expect differences. And that could be something like, well, COVID-19 happened, and we expect that there will be systematic shifts in how people behave, in how people think, in the healthcare sector delivery, or whatever it is you're discussing, right? Or it could be that we had a policy. A policy was passed, so we expect that the effect of that policy would have some overall shift in how whatever happens. There has to be an argument for why we expect that differences will occur between then and now. So, because if you just get into the habit of publishing a paper for every new data points that you have, that's just salami slicing now, right? You're just repeating yourself without a clear justification as to why we expect that things have changed since the last one you published. So don't just say what, where, when. Give an explanation for why we expect that differences will exist based on your hypothesis. The next interrogative pronoun we can use is who. And again, that's talking about segments of a population. So we have data for that population, but not this. In general, there are certain populations that are special populations because we typically don't have a lot of research on them. Think of populations like the youth population, pediatric populations, or people in prison. Most research is done among the civilian, non-institutionalized population. So when you have people who are typically excluded from most sampling frames, oh, that makes your research quite interesting. If you send a paper on tobacco use among prisoners, of course, I'm interested to read it. If you send a paper on tobacco use among military personnel, of course, that's interesting because they're typically not covered in most of our mainstream surveys. They're typically excluded from most sampling frames. So that is how you can also frame your research in terms of the innovation you bring to the table. And then how? How means the methodology. We did it that way, but not this better way. I put the word better because obviously you don't want to tell us that you've done it the worst way and somehow expect us to buy it. The difference between how you have done it versus how it has historically been done should be better. So this could be something like previous studies did a, convenient sample, but in this study we've used a representative sampling technique to generate estimates that are representative for the whole country. Or it could be something of the nature that previous studies only did descriptive analysis or unadjusted analysis. In this study, we have taken very careful consideration of confounders, right? So our results are more valid. So that way, even if it's the same population, you're addressing a key issue, right? And again, it's very, when you're discussing issues of methodology and you say, previous studies did it that way, but you've done it this way. Once again, you have to establish why that is a threat to validity and precision. So it's not enough to say they did convenience sampling, right? What does that mean? And what's the impact on validity and precision, right? Those are arguments that you have to speak like a scientist and lay out your arguments, full arguments, not just half arguments. So you have a premise and a conclusion. So every argument should have those two elements, a premise and a conclusion. The premise is this, and therefore this is what we expect. And that paves the way for you to establish your arguments very credibly. And then the last problematic question is what we might call a questionable impact question. This is a question which it might check all the other boxes, but it evokes a reaction of, so what? Like, why did you do this, right? Because there's no apparent clarity that this has any impact on anything. This is Tobacco Control Journal. This is on the website. You see that they have this information shared with authors, which says the editors will generally not give high priority to, one, studies of smoking prevalence and its correlates. These are best suited to national journals. Few people living outside a country are interested in whether that country has 30% or 35% of smokers, right? And so typically this is an offense you see most, a good number of early career researchers, engaging. It's like, oh, prevalence of smoking in this small hospital, in this small town in this country. It's like, really, like, why would you imagine that anybody wants to read that? Like, who, it's now that doesn't mean that it's not impactful in that context. But again, remember, the role of a journal editor is to grow the journal. And you can't grow a journal by publishing work saying smoking prevalence among people in this tiny hospital, in this tiny town, right? So you have to put yourself consistently in the shoes of the editor to realize what the possible decision might be on your manuscript. The second example is knowledge, attitudes, and behavior of particular population groups. This is the so-called KAB studies. KAB studies are great for people who are very early career. A master student doing work, you expect to see that kind of work, KAB. But as you grow in your career, we expect to see quite a difference in the kind of work you're doing, right? So if you're not an expert in KAB studies, you want to perhaps look at how do you elevate the kind of work you're doing, right? A KAB study, knowledge, attitudes, and behavior is purely descriptive. So you want to advance. How about building capacity for doing more advanced studies, longitudinal studies, doing experimental studies? And we're going to talk a little about that, because the goal is not just to be stuck, right? It's like, you have a child, child drinks milk. At some point, you expect this child to start, hopefully start eating solid food and growing. So you don't really want to be stuck in the realm of KAB studies forever and ever, because there's an expectation that you do better. And again, if you also want to win grants and be competitive, then you definitely have to grow better. And journals in general will not be very receptive, except when the KAB study is something that involves something really novel, something really new. Then it might be appealing. But in general, just writing knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, like I said, that's something we will expect from a master's student or a bachelor level student, but not from somebody who's doing, for example, a PhD or a tenured faculty. Then Papers which are replications of already well-established findings or which offer little new information. That's very obvious. And then local studies where the implication for the journal's international audience are unclear. So again, remember, when it comes to impact, every work is impactful. We can't point to work and say, oh, that work has no impact. But impact is very subjective. And when it comes to publishing in a scientific journal, the only person whose opinion matters, unfortunately, is the editor-in-chief, because he or she has to decide whether or not to publish your work. So we want to give careful thought to that. Now, here, what I will encourage people who are, mid-career or advanced career to think about as a shift from KAB studies. Think about how can I conduct longitudinal studies, right? Longitudinal studies are great because you address several biases. It's great to look at it from the perspective of bias or threats to validity in your research. So the more advanced you grow in your career, there's an expectation that you will think more systematically about threats to validity and address them. So longitudinal studies allow us to address the issue of time because we're collecting data sequentially over time. And so we can know that this is when this exposure happened and this is when this corresponding outcome happened. You can also design experiments. When we think of experiments, you might think of, oh, test tubes and some large lab. No, you can also design online experiments. And here's a kicker, right? The same effort you are using to create a questionnaire to collect information on the KAB study is the exact same effort that you could have used to design a more robust study, like, a longitudinal study or an experiment, for example, with factorial designs, right? Or with the discrete choice experiment. So the same effort and the same amount of time, has been used. So if you're going to spend that amount of time to design a KAB study, the argument then is, why don't you just use that to design a study that is more robust and that would lend itself to you being published in a much more high impact factor journal? So that's the whole point of what we're trying to achieve in the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, to unveil some of these more advanced designs that you may not be very familiar with, so that you're empowered to explore them in your future work. So taking together, a good research question should have all the elements of PICO where applicable. The framing should be such that each question ends in a question mark. It should be impactful, right? I won't say impactful, it means that the research is tied to policy or it is tied to a program. It's not just, you're just doing this paper for just doing sake. And it should be novel. So how do you come up with ideas for a paper then? Well, many, many ways. You can look at published priorities. To Google, for example, whatever your field, research priorities in blank, type in the name of the field. You most likely see priorities that agencies or some organizations have written and said, these are the priorities for this field. So start from the easiest thing first. Google is the easiest thing you could do, right? Or well, maybe now in the era of ChatGPT. And the idea is not that you take that final, whatever it comes out and run away with it. It's just to inspire some thinking in you. So, and then you can also look at journals. Journals typically release call for papers. When journals release calls for papers, what editors do is they look at the field and look at what are the areas that need to be addressed from the perspective of policy or programs. And then they say, here are the topics that we want you to address if you're going to respond to this call. And so even if you do not plan to submit a paper in response to that call, going through that is very insightful because it can stimulate your ideation process so that you can come up with your own ideas for your work. Call for proposals is a similar thing, but this time is from funding agencies. Funding agencies like NIH would say, here's what we are interested in you responding to, right? And that's great because the list of things they're putting forward are things that are quite impactful, right? There's no such thing as free money where, the agencies just, dole out cash for nothing. They want those questions answered because those questions have real value from a policy perspective. And so looking at calls for announcements is definitely important too. You can also look at recently published papers. Go to the top 3 or 5 journals in your field and look at what those papers have published in recent times. You can read through it, and sometimes you can just steal an idea. Maybe they maybe the authors looked at the role of ICOS risk perceptions on cigarette smoking from a policy pilot study in their country. So, for example, this one is looking at cigarette smuggling in New Zealand. Oh, that's interesting. I could borrow that idea and look at smuggling in my own context, right? Picasso says, great artists steal. You can steal an idea and apply it to your local context with any of the interrogative pronouns we mentioned earlier. So that's definitely one way you can use to trigger ideas for research. You can speak to your mentors and you can look at survey questionnaires. Like we said earlier, there are two approaches to research. One is data-driven, where you sit down with the data and look, okay, this data set I have, what can we explore from it, right? There's just so many public data sets available. The next week, we're going to cover some of that. And you can just simply take any of those and say, okay, I want to go through the National Youth Tobacco Survey. And every year, these surveys are conducted, and every year they add new questions, different questions. So I'm going to take, let's say, 2021 wave of a survey, and I'm just going to go through the questions, right? And just going through that might trigger an idea that, oh, wow, this is interesting. I don't think anybody has worked on it. So that's one way you can also explore. But as we do all of that, we want to have some basic things in mind. One, that data is not equal to information, right? The whole idea of research is to take data and create information from it, from the whole process, right? So we never want to forget that. That is ultimately what we're doing. So when the output of your work is now more complicated than what you even started with, that's not a good place to be in. We want to simplify things. When desirable is not available, the available must become desirable. So you might want to work with primary data set, collect your own data, but you may not have time, you may not have money, you may not have the resources to do that. Look for what is available and work with it, right? Stop demanding for the ideal when you can't access it. So learn to become more agile as a researcher. And that means exploring things you have around you and making use of them. Very, very important. Number 3, data must be fit for use and fit for purpose. That is so important, and we cannot emphasize that enough. As we explore research in the next few weeks, one of the things we'll emphasize over and over is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Especially when we're using observational data, we want to be aware of the limitations of this data. Number 5, local is better, but don't act as though you lived in a cave. Like we said, every research is impactful, right? Impactful research is not necessarily defined by the geographic origin of the data. It's defined by how global we are in our thinking. So when you're framing your research, learn to address issues that other countries or people in other countries might benefit from. So you might imagine that your editor-in-chief might be in New Zealand or it might be in the United States and you are in, let's say, Ghana. How can you frame a research question in a way that readers from around the world might find it relevant? Relevant because the issues you have raised also apply to them, right? If you say prevalence of smoking among people in this hospital, there's nobody who finds that relevant to their own context because it's completely out of scope to them. But when you frame things in a way that, for example, addresses policy or addresses issues of monitoring or surveillance, then there are shared lessons for everybody. So even though you're using local data, think globally and think of how other people can share from your experiences. That is when you make it easier for journals to accept your work. Again, like we emphasize over and over, don't ask for the data what the data can answer. And this is not only when you start analyzing the data. This starts right from when you are creating your research question, when you are framing a question. So being conscious of this thing I'm asking, can I actually answer it from the data, right? Am I overflogging the data, right? Don't frame research questions that require too many subgroup analysis, right? It's okay to just examine issues among the broad group. And as we explore, we want to make sure that we are mindful of our own inherent biases. Now, our research questions are driven by biases, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's a reason why we frame a research question one way versus another way, because our biases drive the way we frame questions. But what we ask is that once a research question has been framed, the way we investigate that question should be as objective as possible, right? We don't want to inject our biases in the investigative process. And we're going to talk more about that in the next few weeks. Again, we want to mind the gap, want to tell a story. And that's very important. The art of telling a story. That's something we don't emphasize enough in graduate school. We talk about science and how things are should be objective, but storytelling is such an art because that is also how you sell your idea to a journal, to the editor, right? Um, you know, the art of telling a narrative or creating a narrative from the data, and even with your research question, right? How do we do that, right? So it requires us to explore different aspects of the question. We're going to have a demo where I'm going to do that in a minute so that we can see how that plays in together. Um, as simple as possible, as complex as necessary, but always reproducible. Um, we said initially that research is about showmanship, but the goal is not about showing to the readers that, wow, you're so knowledgeable that, the goal is not never to speak over people's heads. There's a reason why small words exist in a dictionary, right? So if wherever possible, use small words. Wherever possible, use small methodology that, simpler methodology that people can understand. Because if the goal is to communicate and you're not communicating, then the whole purpose is lost, right? So it's the goal is never to impress. The goal is to always instruct and to share knowledge. And primary data where you must, and secondary data where you can. Right. So what I want to do now is to take a research question, an idea, and see how we can take that idea in its rough idea stage and transform it into a research question, and in such a way that we apply all of these principles that we've talked about. So if somebody has an idea, and in fact, the more rough the idea is, the better it is. So we can take that idea and see how we can formulate a research question from it. So if anyone has any suggested idea, it doesn't have, like I said, it doesn't have to be fully fleshed at all. It can be as rough as it is, and then we can explore it together.
Felix? You can unmute yourself, Felix. We can't hear you. Okay, let's move to Chris. Please unmute yourself, Chris.
Oops. Can you hear me? Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. I'm a political science student, so forgive me, I'll say something political. What about a comparative analysis of EU and US democracy promotion activity in Nigeria since the start of the century?
Okay. So that kind of question is more we can explore it, but just to put some caveat to it. I would pick another idea that is more applicable to most people. Now, the idea you've suggested, and we're going to explore it, right? The problem is that from a political science, some of those things are more of qualitative in the way they are abstracted, right? So I'm still going to dig into that as a second example, but the first example I want to cover, I want it to be something that is broad scoped and applies to a lot of people. But we'll definitely not ignore your idea. We'll definitely address it in a minute. All right, so I think I'll just pick the first one that's on this list, which is poor data reporting to primary healthcare facilities. So this is the question that was posed. All right. So who can tell us, based on what we've covered, right? What are some of the problems with this question based on what we've covered? Does anyone see anything wrong based on the 6 issues we covered?
Yes.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
The element of PICOTS is not well integrated into it.
Excellent.
It is a no question, sir.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a no question. Very good. So
like an essay question, essay topic.
exactly. There is no question mark, right?
It doesn't
Uh,
have
Question.
There is no timeline.
it doesn't
There's no clarity. There's no timeline.
Okay, excellent. All right. So what we're going to do, what we're going to do now is we're going to take that question and refine it, and then we can then see how we can then improve it. I'm going to show you one aspect of the platform. Nungile, please, can you meet everyone? I think there's a lot of background noise. Thank you. I hope you have not muted me too. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome, already. So I'm going to show you a tool on the Chisquares platform that you can easily use to create questions or to refine your questions. And this will apply to whatever question you're asking, right? And then the goal is that you use it as a first stab at improving the question, and then you take the result and then improve it further. So let's do that. So I'm going to use the Chisquares platform. And for those who are not familiar with the Chisquares platform, it's a one-stop shop for research, right? You can design studies on the platform, collect data. So for example, this is a survey that we have ongoing. You can, anything that is related to research, you can do it on the platform. But for now, what we're interested in is to see how we can use the AI toolkit on the Chisquares platform to refine that question we talked about, so that we can see how do we make that statement to become a question, and what elements in that whole process could be used to make it more appealing. So once you log into the Chisquares platform, and to log in, you go to the website, which is www.chisquares.com. And once you're logged in, if you don't have an account, you have to create an account. You come to the AI toolkit, which is where we want to use for the research question. The AI toolkit has several tools in it. For today, what we're interested in is the research question generator. So I'm going to click on that, and then it opens up this 2 fields for me to just type what the research question is. It doesn't have to be a good research question. It can be just a rough idea. In this case, this is what I have. For data reporting in primary healthcare facilities, I'm just going to type the same thing. I'm just going to enter there for efficiency. Again, it doesn't ask much of you. All you have to do is just enter that idea, and you click on generate questions. So what it does is I take that idea, and it's going to work on creating a question for us. You don't have to sit down and wait for it to create the questions. You can go about your business and still come back to that. So I can do, if I have other things I'm doing, I can come back, I can go around and come back to read when I'm done. So let's come back here. So it has finished with the exploration. Now this is what we put in here: pod data reporting in the healthcare facilities. What the platform has done is this: it has given us a total of, let's see, 16 research questions, 15 here, plus the main one here, which is the 16th one, right? This is the one it feels that's optimized for very well. But then in case you don't like that one, it has given you some other ones to explore. So the first one it has given us is there a correlation between poor data reporting practices in primary healthcare facilities and overall healthcare outcomes? So that's the research question it has framed, right? Of course, you can look at that research question in a million ways, but this is what it has optimized for. Now, as you can see, with this ends in the research question. The exposure and outcomes are much more better defined. We will have to do our own work to add in the population and other elements, because obviously there's no way the platform will know what our population is. But then, in addition to giving us a research question, it has provided aims for us to think about. So here, for example, we have 3 aims. The aim 1 is investigate the impact of poor data reporting practices on healthcare outcomes in primary health facilities. So in general, we have the research question, which is the top of the pile for what we're trying to do. And then we have aims. Aims are simply like the mechanisms through which we're going to answer the research question. And then under each aim, we have objectives. Objectives, think of them as like the children of the aims. So this aim is saying to investigate the impact of poor data reporting practices on healthcare outcomes in primary health facilities. So the objectives are the specific ways that aim will be achieved in terms of the research itself. So objective 1 is to identify the extent of data reporting issues in primary healthcare facilities. Objective 2 is to examine the effect of poor data reporting on the accuracy and completeness of healthcare data. Objective 3 is to determine how poor data reporting impacts decision-making and quality of care in primary healthcare facilities. And then you have a hypothesis. Whenever you have an aim, it's recommended for you to have a hypothesis. And the reason why it's recommended is because it should be very clear that you didn't just spin the wheel of epidemiology and just grab the first question that came to your mind. It should be clear that you've thought about that. The hypothesis tells us the direction which you think the results will go, right? We call hypothesis an educated guess, but it's based on premise. So here the hypothesis is that poor data reporting in primary healthcare facilities leads to decreased accuracy and completeness of healthcare data, and ultimately results in inferior healthcare outcomes. So that's aim 1. Aim 2 is to explore the factors contributing to poor data reporting in primary healthcare facilities. And we have 3 objectives under this: to examine issues of training and resources availability, to investigate organizational culture and leadership support for data reporting in primary healthcare facilities, and to identify potential barriers and challenges to effective data reporting in primary healthcare facilities. And again, we have a hypothesis. Our hypothesis here is that inadequate training, resources, and organizational support are likely key factors that contribute to poor data reporting. And then aim 3 is to compare data reporting practices among primary healthcare facilities in different geographic regions. And our specific objectives here are to compare reporting practices and training across different regions, to analyze healthcare outcomes in regions with varying levels of data reporting effectiveness, and to investigate potential differences in barriers and challenges to effective data reporting among different regions. Again, we have a hypothesis, which is that primary healthcare facilities in regions with stronger data reporting practices and resources will have better healthcare outcomes compared to those in regions with weaker data reporting practices. So this is the primary research question that the platform has said, well, in view of what you gave me, I think that this is the best question for you. But just in case you don't like that research question, here are 15 other research questions that you can possibly explore. So the one says, is data reporting in primary healthcare facilities associated with delays in treatment? You see, that one is looking at a different domain altogether. Like, it's looking about how does poor data quality result in delays in treatment? This one says, what types of data are frequently misreported in primary healthcare facilities, and how does this impact patient care? The next one says, does the level of training and education of staff influence their accuracy and the level of completeness of data? Number 4 looks at major barriers to accurate data reporting. 5 looks at how does poor data reporting in primary healthcare facilities affect overall quality of healthcare services provided? And so on and so forth. I like number 10. Does availability of technological resources impact the accuracy and completeness of data reporting? Right. So the idea is that the role of AI is to help you, not to replace you. The goal is that you can then take these ideas, sit down and reformulate your research question properly. to match the elements of PICO, right? So at least now, what you have solved is the issue of ideation. Like, okay, what do I explore? How do I? You have enough ideas now to explore. Now it's your turn to pick up those ideas and to sharpen them and customize them to what you want to do, right? So that's how the Chisquares platform assists with that aspect of research. In the next few weeks, we're going to look at a lot more tools. We'll talk about how can we create proposals, how do we calculate sample size, and many other aspects of research that we need to address. Does anyone have any questions on this? I see some hands up. If the owner of a question has any questions, they can comment too. So I'll encourage you to the best way to learn. Yes, go ahead, please. Yes.
My name is Kevin. Actually, I'm a public health. I'm my first year in public health. I'm interested in kidney dialysis, kidney failure, and transportation research. So I really don't know how to go about it.
Okay. So how you're going to go about it is that you're going to go to the same process we did. Obviously, this process is generalizable to any question you're doing, right? The process is exactly the same. You go to the toolkits and you type in the specific. So here is the research question generator. You don't have to try to make it fancy or try to make it nice. In our case, this is literally what we copied. Poor data reporting in primary healthcare facilities. We literally just type that here and here. You don't even have to try and make it different, right? Whatever idea, what you express is good enough an idea. Just type it here and search and plot. The whole idea is that the toolkit is supposed to be your thought partner to help you brainstorm ideas, right? You ultimately are the owner of the idea. You are the researcher, right? But at least it helps you with the ideation part so that we can have ideas and then work on streamlining those ideas based on what we've learned today. And then you can have a good research question to proceed with. So obviously we can't explore every single idea and show how to explore it. The whole purpose of that short demo was just to show you how to do it so that you know, after the class, you can then practice on generating your own questions with the tool. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it.
Welcome. And so the original question about comparative analysis of democracy in the United States and Europe. Let me just, since I indicated that we're going to come back to that, let me just type it. So, and I may have forgotten the nuances of the question, but I'm going to type it the way I remember it. So I think it was comparative evaluation of democratic norms in Africa versus Europe. I believe that was the question. And if it's not, well, so again, I can just type the same thing, literally the exact same thing. The research question doesn't have to be well-defined. So you don't have to try to make it look cute or look sophisticated. Just type whatever you can type and click on generate questions. While it's working, you can literally go and do other things that you need to do. And then, you know, so you don't have to be tied there waiting for it. And then you can always come back to and fetch the answers that have been generated. So it's still trying to generate the questions. They suggest the questions. And so while it's still trying to do that, like I said, you can, if you have other things, oops, that's a lot of red ink. You can still continue with whatever you're doing, and then you can explore the answers as generated in real time. If anyone has questions while we wait for this to be generated, you can. Okay, great. It has. Is there any way, Lungi, is there any way I can remove this red? Okay, great. Thank you very much. So for that idea, the research question is there a difference in the implementation and adherence to democratic norms between Africa and Europe. And again, that's given us the main research question it has optimized for. In addition, it has given us other research questions that we can explore. So the one here, the aims are investigate the key aspects of democratic norms in Africa and Europe. The objectives are compare the historical developments and evolution of democratic norms in Africa and Europe, analyze the current political climate and government structures in African and European countries, and examine the role of cultural influences on the understanding and implementation of democratic norms in Africa and Europe. Then the second aim is to explore alternative factors that may impact democratic norms in Africa and Europe. So investigate the influence of colonialism on the formation of democratic norms in Africa and Europe, to examine the impact of economic disparities, and to analyze the role of international organizations and interventions in promoting or hindering democratic norms in Africa and Europe. And then lastly, the last aim is to conduct a comparative analysis of democratic norms in Africa and Europe. Specific objectives are to compare the level of citizen participation and engagement in democratic processes, to examine the role of media and social media in shaping public perceptions, and to investigate the impact of education and literacy rates on democratic norms. So if you are supposed to be the subject matter expert, I'm not a political scientist, but it looks right to me based on the kind of things I would expect. But ultimately, you as the researcher, you are the one in the driver's seat. You're the one, the goal is not for you to just take everything that AI has given you blindly and just walk away with it, right? That's why you have this reminder that it's AI at the end of the day. It's your job to now sit down and say, okay, here is how we're going to refine this to align with what we want. And should you not want that particular research question, there are others here that you could also explore. I think the beauty lies in when you now take elements from the different parts and you can then create a coherent question that addresses the depth and the breadth of what you're trying to investigate. Okay. Any other questions on this process? So I'll encourage everyone practice. That's the best way you can learn anything. So before immediately after this class, you should definitely try and take any rough idea and see how can you create a question or questions that are very well defined with the toolkits. And I think that will go a long way in helping. So nobody should struggle that, oh, I don't seem to have an idea for my research. That problem should never exist, because that's the whole point of the toolkit, to take whatever rough idea you have and give you a whole ton of ideas that are framed in a scientific manner. Or sorry, Lungile, you were saying something.
Yes.
Yes. Up here.
Good evening.
Hello.
Yes, good evening. This is Barnabas Opio.
Hello.
From Uganda. Kyambogo University, a PhD student for biological science.
Well, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you. I would like to have an inquiry on having both a research question and a hypothesis in this, having all of them in the same proposal setup. My basic understanding is that when you have chosen on a research question, you don't now go for hypothesis testing. I wonder if you would make clarification on that, Prof.
Okay, thank you. So, you mentioned two things. I just wanted to build up on your answer, because you have answered the question already. You have said, you've mentioned the word hypothesis, and then you mentioned a different word, which is hypothesis testing. Very two different things, right? Hypothesis says there will be significant differences in the understanding and adherence to democratic norms between Africa and Europe. That is a hypothesis. This hypothesis. I am not testing the hypothesis yet. The test will come later when I collect the data and then I evaluate it. So those are two different things that are very, very separate. The hypothesis is my own educated guess of where I think the result will go. testing is when I now subject that hypothesis to statistical tests to see whether it's true. The hypothesis and hypothesis testing are also different in terms of their directionality. When we frame hypotheses, they have a direction. So in this case, I'm saying that there will be significant differences, right? I'm saying that, you know, the direction I expect it to go. When we are testing the hypothesis, however, we tend to be neutral, right? We, you know, that's why we always want to recommend a two-sided hypothesis, because even if I believe that so will be beneficial on so, when it comes to the test, we have to be objective. And that's why we always state that our null hypothesis is that there is no difference between the two groups. For example, if we're looking at Africa and Europe, in this context, we're saying that the null hypothesis is one of no difference. There are no significant differences in the democratic norms between Africa and Europe. That is our null, because we are framing it in the null because we want to be objective. The reason why we will go for a two-sided hypothesis test is because we believe that we are open to the idea that, well, the results can go in any direction, and we are fine with it. That, well, I believe that this result will go this way. That was my hypothesis. But in the testing, I'm open to it going in any direction, right? So in a nutshell, there's a difference between your hypothesis and the test of the hypothesis. The hypothesis is framed in your proposal or your research question. The testing of the hypothesis takes place when you now collect your data and you're writing your methodology or your results. That's when you now test it. Way, way later when you have collected the data. I hope that difference is clear. Okay, I will assume it is. Any other questions?
Okay. Can I just ask first, everyone, can you please complete the survey? That's the evaluation survey. So in order for you to receive your certificates, we need your name and your email address at the end of the survey. Should you wish to skip some questions, you can, but we would really like to know how the session went and your recommendations. So please complete the survey, and most importantly, please provide your name and your email address, a correct email address, and be sure to submit the survey once you're done. Thank you. I'm sharing it again. I've been sharing it. There it is. Okay, thank you. All right, so more questions. We have Hammond Johnson. Please unmute. Okay. Charles, are you able to unmute yourself?
Okay. Good day, Prof. Lungile, thanks. Happy New Year.
Hello.
I'm just trying to kind of ask, like the way we normally use the platform to generate either research questions or proposals. It usually comes in these multiple aims and multiple objectives. I kind of understand because Prof had earlier on last year explained that this more or less NIH format. However, me, I'm in Nigeria, and when you submit some document like this, because in quotes, and I stand to be corrected, and I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, most of our lecturers and some senior scholars here, they just stick to what they already know and to a particular pattern. So you put something like this, they kind of tell you can't have two ends. You can't have two M's. You can't have more than one M in a study, something like that. And when you are framing a topic or a title for your research, they also try to limit what kind of box you in a particular way. So that's one. Two is that using the platform, I've observed, especially when you want to generate the proposals, oftentimes the topics comes exploring. Majority out of 10 times you kind of generate content. The title comes exploring, it comes in that way. I understand that one need to it's more or less like a guide, a super guide to help you reduce a lot of thinking would have done. But I don't know if can the platform use more other synonyms in couching the topics, and can you also script out aims like in a particular proposal, like 1 aim, or kind of ask the person how many aims you would want for the particular content. Over, Prof.
Thank you. So I think it's very important for us to realize the intended use, and maybe I'll just read out this, but I think that frames the limits of the platform of the AI toolkit. So it says here the Chi-Squares platform uses AI to generate content quickly, but user input is essential for customizing and refining the final output, right? While AI provides a strong framework, it may occasionally make errors, and references may not be perfectly aligned with the text due to automatic search. Please review and adjust the content to ensure accuracy and relevance to your specific needs. So the point is that it's impossible to build specificity for every single user. And the goal of the platform, the AI toolkit, was never designed to create a very custom solution for every human, right? It just provides a broad framework. So for example, it gives you 3 aims. Well, if you want only 1 aim, it's simple, right? You can just pick 1 aim and proceed with it. You don't have to use all of that. So that's what I would just say. It provides a framework for you, but ultimately you are the one in the driver's seat. It was never meant for you to download and just go and submit to whoever you're submitting to. That would actually be far from what it was designed for. So the best practice is you can use as much of it as you need, or none of it as needed. You might decide that, well, I just want to frame it myself, which is perfectly fine too, right? So for those who need it to create questions or for ideation, it's awesome. For those who don't need it, it's awesome too. But ultimately the point is that it's designed such that you can take the ideas and then build on it, not just download and then submit. So that'll be my response to that. So again, it's AI. AI can only do what AI can do, and it's never meant to replace you as an investigator. So I hope that's clear. Any other questions? See a lot of hands up.
Yes. I'm just trying to avoid having a situation where everyone is talking at once. It's just taking a bit of time. Chima, can you unmute yourself?
Hello, good evening.
Hello.
Hello, good evening, sir.
I can hear you clearly. Hi.
Thank you so much. This is my first time of joining this lecture, and it is quite eye-opening. And I hope subsequently I will gain more about from the study. So exploring the Chi-Square websites, now I discovered that one can calculate sample size on the website. So I was just thinking how I will, because in my center, if you quote sample size or whatever, or how you calculated, you are expected to reference it. So how will I reference Chi-Square, and if I use other services on Chi-Square, how will I reference it?
So when you go to, we're going to consider sample size in future sessions, I believe the next one. But when you calculate sample size, so for example, let's say you're trying to calculate sample size for a cross-sectional study. I'm just going to provide some random parameters there. When you calculate the sample size, you can click on show reference, right? And when you click there, it tells you the formula that was used It explains all the parameters in that formula, and you can copy the citation right there. So that that should be relevant for the use case you have in mind. But we're going to cover more about the mechanics of sample size calculation in next week, really.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Can you hear me?
Clearly, yes.
All right, thank you very much. I was the one who asked about the EU and US democracy promotion. Prof, I have two questions I want to ask. The first being that after the generation of the research question by this AI tool, do we have to copy do we have to take into consideration every of the aim in terms of maybe crafting our manuscript later on? And secondly, because there are three aims that it generates, three aims with also three objectives and also hypotheses for each of the aims. Do we have to just pick one of the aim and work with the objective, or we have to pick the three? Then secondly is concerning research question. When I remember attending my research methodology class, and my professor was heavily pointing to the fact that we need to always select the why question. And when I submitted to a journal, they rejected my paper saying that it was too descriptive when I was asking the how. And I find other research that are mostly using the varieties of pronouns that you stated. So how do we reconcile this? Must we always go with the why, or we can ask what and other forms of question? Thank you.
You're welcome. So for the first question, which is how to use the output from the question generator, you can use it however the AI toolkit is by no means your supervisor that you or your you don't have to do what it tells you, right? It's just giving you suggestions, and we believe that more information is always a good thing compared to less information. So it's giving you a very detailed framework for how you could think about the question and how you could approach it. So that is quite different from saying this is how you must. I mean, obviously, it's no means tell you what to do, right? It's just giving you suggestions for how you could think. So you are the owner of a research question, so it's now your responsibility to say, okay, sure, I see this, but this is how I'm going to frame it. So the whole idea is to empower you with more ideas than you might have thought about, so that you can then have your own research strategy and formulate the research question that you want, because you have the context, you have the nuances, the issues that AI obviously does not know. So you are the most important person as far as defining what the scope of the research will be. Regarding your other question about the why questions. So in general, why questions are notoriously more qualitative in nature. So even with the slide that I shared earlier, let me go back to that page. We generally, why tends to be too broad, right? So you can say, why do people smoke? Oh, because they're poor. Okay, why are they poor? Well, because they are unemployed. Oh, why are they unemployed? Why questions lead to a cascade of more and more whys until we have to just come up with a point where we say we're going to assume that this is the baseline knowledge and we're going to build from there. So, and that's why mixed methods researchers, of course, mixed methods could be any mixture of methods, but most of the mixed methods tend to be qualitative and quantitative, because the quantitative will answer these other questions in green, and then the qualitative will answer the why part, which is almost impossible to answer empirically, quantitatively. The why provides the context that we will not know. So, for example, you might say, what percentage of the gap in male-female smoking differences is explained by, let's say, stress, right? So you say, okay, I'm going to do a decomposition analysis to measure what percentage of the gender differences in smoking is attributable to this factor. Sure, you can measure and say 30% of that difference is there, but the question then is why? Why? And so that's why qualitative is great, because it allows us to give us context. It explains the why behind the what and the where and the when. So that's how you can, balance the two. But at the end of the day, just also realizing that peer review is inherently subjective, and people can reject the paper for any reason at all. And so you shouldn't take it as a failure of the paper. It could just be that this is how that person felt about that issue.
Thank you. Can I just ask everyone, those who are posting their, oops. Okay, please don't share your email addresses here on the chat box. I'm sharing the link again. Please complete the survey.
So,
okay, please ask your questions. Shuffle.
What the person asked, I want to answer a question on the chat. What's the purpose of this? Can you mute yourself, please? Hello? Okay. So somebody asked a question on the chat, which I just wanted to quickly answer because it's a very important question. It says, I want to believe this hypothesis from AI are the null hypothesis. So this goes back to the question the other individual asked, that, the difference between hypothesis and hypothesis testing. It is when it comes to hypothesis testing that we have the null and we have the alternative hypothesis. If we are testing anything, obviously we have to test anything against something. So hypothesis testing is what comes with null and with alternative, right? The hypothesis alone is just a subjective statement of mine that this is where I expect this thing to go. It doesn't have a null or anything because I'm not testing it yet. I'm just telling you what I think. Think of it as just plain language speaking. When we're speaking, we say, oh, what do you think about this? Nobody starts saying, well, this is the null perspective of which I stand. Just tell us how you think about the issue. So the hypothesis being framed there are just your hypothesis as a researcher from the perspective of question generation. Later on, when we now go to test those hypotheses, we will then have a null hypothesis against which we are testing, and then we'll have the alternative. So I think that distinction is very clear, which we need to emphasize, that framing hypothesis at the point of question generation is very different, completely different from testing hypothesis statistically when we come to analysis. One, it has to do with generating a question or coming up with a research question. The other has to do with statistics and data analysis. Very different. All right, please, the person who was asking the question can ask now.
Good evening. Called Chafo Ramson, and I'm from Cameroon. And when I was going through the class, I started the class a bit late. And when I was as the lecture was going on, I didn't actually understand that part of that AI Q generation of questions. And I wish to ask Prof if you can take it again.
Okay. So what we're saying is, okay. So what we're saying is, if you have an idea, any idea for your work, and you are like, okay, I need to turn this idea into a research question, you come to the AI toolkit, and you log into the Chisquares platform, and then you find your way to the AI toolkit here, and you come to the AI research question generator. What it simply does is it takes your idea, whatever it is, and suggests research questions. It is by no means requiring you to do it that way or commanding you to do it or enforcing you to do it that way. It's just, you can think of it as a mentor, your thought partner, or the person you're brainstorming with. So instead of you sitting down like, oh, geez, what am I going to research? You can put your ideas there and it's going to come up with suggested questions and objectives and hypotheses for you that you can then use in your work. Again, the goal is not for you to take that output as is and just run away with it. The goal is for you to now sit down as the investigator and think through that process and then finalize your research, the question or framing or hypothesis or whatever it is.
Thanks, Prof. There's a question here. Is it ethical to use the content produced by AI and use it on one's proposal without any modifications?
it's so let's answer that question by looking at so that question would depend on what your policies are, university's policies are. If it's in some institutions, if the institution has banned you from using AI, well, then you cannot use AI, right? But short of institutional policies, there's obviously nothing unethical about using AI. So you can read more on, let's see, the Premier Agency for Institution for policies on or ethical policies on research. We're going to share the link with you later. But essentially, let's go that quickly. So AI ethics. So what some of these things you can read them on your own and see what different organizations recommend about them. So it depends on where you are. But in general, there's no recommendation or there's no prohibition. Now, some journals have different standards as well. So for example, if you're publishing in a Journal of American Medical Association, they might have a position statement. So the question is very broad, and it's almost impossible to answer it categorically. But the point is that there's nothing inherently unethical about using AI. AI it's like the same way you use Python or R for data analysis. When you analyze data, nobody expects you to bring out your fingers and toes and start counting. We expect, obviously, you're going to use technology to help you with productivity. That's the exact same way that we expect, with AI. So, but ultimately depends on your institutional policies and what your supervisor, your institution, or your department has said. So that will ultimately be what I would say to you on that.
Thank you. Okay, so for those who are joining us for the first time, you're welcome to leave. So as soon as Prof is done with the presentation and you have completed the survey, you're welcome to leave. This is just a Q&A. It lasts for as long as we have questions. So yeah, those who are asking, I hope that is clear. Okay. Michael Idol, please unmute yourself.
Good evening, Prof. And good everyone, and thank you for the presentation. So my question has to do with the writing of the null hypothesis. So you would agree that doing so doesn't doesn't stop one from thinking a certain way as to how the outcome of the research may be. So are there scientific ways to help one to ensure that what they are thinking, how they're thinking the research outcome is going to be, will not be will not influence how they think, will not influence the outcome of the research, is what I'm trying to ask.
I see your point. So how you think cannot influence the research. So let's cover two aspects. What you're asking is fundamentally, how do I prevent my subjectivity into bleeding into my research question?
Exactly.
That's I'm rephrasing what you're saying, right? And the answer is no, you should not. Your subjectivity has to bleed into the question. So let's take it this way, right? You have a question. Let's see. So let's take it this way. This is the point of the ideation. And this is the point where you're answering the question, right? Up to this point, it's fine. Of course, we expect your subjectivity. There's a reason why I even come up with the research question and saying, for example, what factors or how do we prevent this, or what factors are associated with adherence to this medication, right? So your research questions obviously need to have all your biases. Because you cannot, we are humans, and that's why we ask questions. We ask questions because those questions are things we care about. We care about them because they are things that are personal. They are personal because they're subjective. So there's no requirement that your research question be objective, because there's no such thing as an objective research question. All research questions are by definition subjective because they come from our own biases. So this is subjective. But what we are saying is that once you have answered this question that came from your own biases, this second part, which is now how we're going to evaluate that question, should be objective. Do you understand the difference there? So the question can be, I might be a political scientist and say, what factors are associated with Republicans, or winning an election? Like, why did I say Republicans and not Democrat? Well, because I'm biased. That's fine. You can frame the research question based on your biases. There's no such thing as an objective research question. All research questions are subjective. But what we're asking is that once you ask that question, the mechanisms in which you evaluate that question must be objective. So what does that mean? For example, it means that the way you frame the research question, the way you frame your null and alternative hypothesis, right? The way you power your study, the two-sided nature of your test. And this is why we say hypothesis testing should be two-sided, is to make sure that this is objective. Because if I say that I believe that this intervention, let's say I'm an educator and I have implemented an intervention. Obviously, I love the intervention. That's why I implemented it. If I hated it, I would not implement it, right? I've implemented intervention. And I'm like, oh, this intervention, I think it saves lives, or I think it improves academic performance. Oh, why did I frame it that way? It's because I'm biased. It's a subjective decision, right? But when it comes to the testing, we need to be objective. We need to say that the null hypothesis is that there's no difference between this intervention and not receiving anything, right? We are open to saying, well, this part may have been subjective, but this part, we're going to be as objective as possible, right? This is also the reason why we do blinding in experiments, where we blind participants so that they don't know what was administered. Is because we want to make sure that even though the research question itself was subjective, the mechanisms through which we evaluate the question are objective. When we design questionnaires, it's also a reason why we try to be balanced and neutral. So we won't say, why do you hate? We won't frame our question this way, right? Why do you hate guns? Like, okay, did I tell you I hate guns? That's very biased and leading question, right? So we will not have questions like this because we know that they are biased. We are allowing our subjectivity here to bleed into this part here, which is a no-no. We have to frame things. So once we have framed the research question, everything in the methodology needs to be brutally objective. I hope that distinction is clear. Okay, I will assume it is.
Yeah. Oscar?
Happy New Year. It's been a long time.
Hello.
Look, my question is, when you were correcting a word using the Nigeria scenario, where the effect was used and you change it to association, the word association and then relationship, do they also have epidemiological implications?
If
you use the word, yes. Does it have epidemiological implications?
Yes, and I'm saying epidemiologically that they're synonyms of each other. So wherever you can use associations, you can use relationships.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? Because all relationships are either two, all relationships are either casual or causal, right? And so associations mean that you are saying that it's a casual relationship. A relationship means anything. A relationship could be causal or it could be associational. So you use the word relationship when you don't want to commit yourself, when you just want to be general and broad and not go into nuances, right? So a causal relationship is a relationship. An associational relationship is a relationship. So you can use the word relationship where you could have used association, and that's fine.
Prof, there was this paper that I read, and it was one of the paper, but it was a book, that if you know you are going to use chi-square in doing your analysis, then you have to bring the association. However, if you are going to use, how do we call these guys at, where you have to plug in the showing the arrows, I mean the lines to show that, to do the comparison, there you have to use the relationship.
Well, okay, that's completely false. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people who speak authoritatively about science who have no business doing so.
Okay.
But that is patently false.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, there's a question, Dr. T. Okay, yeah, Dr. Tilahun. Are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, Wisdom, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes. Good evening, Prof. And
hello.
Good evening, Mumble.
Hello, Wisdom.
From Nigeria. Yeah, good evening. Happy to be here once again. I'm so glad listening to Prof again. Prof, when you started the lecture, you mentioned that there are two types of hypotheses. I mean, research question. The second one is data-driven research question. I am in business management, entrepreneurship, and venture creation. And when you also mentioned that epidemiology is the mother of research, I agree. I quite agree with you, because almost everything you are teaching us in epidemiology research is applicable to my field. And that's actually what drew my interest into these lectures. Please, I want you to please assist me on how can I be able to extract a research question from raw secondary data. By raw secondary data, I mean data that has been collected and has not answered a particular question, but is a secondary data according to what you taught us. So if I see a secondary data, how will I be able to know all that the secondary data has done and what it has not done, so that I can be able to derive my research question from there? Thank you so much.
Yeah. So one of the things, the problem is that the problem with the scenario is that you don't know what you don't know. So you don't know the wall of data out there, and even if you grabbed hold of a particular data set, you don't know all that has been done on it. So the simple answer is that it's not going to be it's not going to be just a click of a button kind of thing. It will require a bit of you going on the fact-finding mission. Now, there are two scenarios here. One is that you know the thing you're interested in, and you know the data set. So let's say I'm interested in tobacco-related issues, let's say, and I know that well, the population I'm interested in is let's say, youth population in America, right? I can decide to pull up a data set. Here, for example, I might, oh, I didn't even finish this question. By the way, what I was trying to, I'm going to answer your question, but I got distracted. COPE guidelines. Let me drop the link for people who want to read about COPE's position statement on AI. So before I press. All right, I'm going to drop this link here. All right. So Wisdom, one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to build a tool that answers this very issue you're addressing, where you can come in, and the same way you type in the research question and it frames it for you, This time you type in the research question and it's going to tell you all the data sets that are available globally that you can explore that research question with. So because that addresses the issue, the premise of the issue is that you don't know what you don't know. You might be interested in entrepreneurship, like you mentioned, and certain aspects of it, but you don't know the totality of data sets around the world that have captured data on that. So that's one of the things. So I guess in a nutshell, you just have to wait for the updates when we release that. But that's one of the problems we're trying to solve, where you just type in whatever research. So let's say you do research on cancer, and you're interested in which let's say cancer and smoking. When you enter that, it will tell you all the data sets in the world that have access to that data, or something similar to it. Now, when you're working with secondary data sets, you have to realize that you have to be a bit more flexible. You might never find a data set that has exactly what you need, but you have to be a bit more nimble to just adapt and just use what's available. Like we said, when the desirable is not available, the available must be desirable at that point. So when we release that tool, when we release the update to the toolkit, we're going to announce it so you can use that.
Thanks. There's a question on YouTube. Please, can you throw some light on testing hypotheses and concluding research findings based on hypothesis test? Must we have hypotheses in every study?
Every quantitative study has a hypothesis, but when we write science, we don't, of course, the way we write science in day-to-day life is quite different from the way we demand that if you are a graduate student, you write it. When you are a graduate student, you're doing a master's or PhD, we demand that you write, this is the null hypothesis, and this is the alternative hypothesis. Nobody writes that way in actual life, but the hypothesis is always implied, even if it's not explicitly stated, right? It's always implied. So let me look for a paper, for example. So let's go to JAMA Open, for example, and look at a paper. So the answer to your question, must we always test hypothesis? Yes. Does every paper test an hypothesis? Yes. Is it always stated that, this is a hypothesis? No, nobody. Like I said, that requirement, we expect students, if you're under training, to write that way, because we want to make sure you know it. But in general, this is how things would typically write. So the question, what is the association between the COVID-19 pandemic and long-term nursing home stay or death following hospital discharge, right? That's a research question. This is a great question, by the way. It ends with the question mark and everything. Nowhere in this paper, at least from what I've seen so far, did they indicate a hypothesis, right? Let's see. Let's look at where they specifically indicated their objective. So here they say, although previous investigators have focused on a decline in functional status and discharge disposition, focusing on, where am I? Its association with long-term NH stay or death has not been reported. Our goal was to study the association between the pandemic and long-term nursing home stay or death among community-dwelling individuals aged 65 years and older, blah, blah, blah. So this is their objective, right? Now, did they come out and say, our hypothesis is so and so? No, they did not. Can we imply an hypothesis from there? Yes, we can. The hypothesis is that there is no association between the pandemic and long-term stay. That's the null hypothesis. The alternative is that there's a difference, right? Now, difference, whether it's for good or for bad, we don't know, right? That is the whole point of testing the hypothesis. And this is why we say that tests should be two-sided so that either way it goes, we are covered. And this is why you always want to report this. Here it says the threshold for statistical significance was two-sided p-value less than 0.05. That's good practice, right? You don't want to test hypothesis, only one-sided. Now, let me just break it down simply. So, hypothesis testing, what does that mean? So we said that I'm saying A is greater than B. That was my hypothesis. That this was my personal hypothesis from the study, right? my hypothesis of a direction. The hypothesis is equal to an educated guess. That's what your hypothesis means, right? I'm guessing that A will be greater than B. Now, when I now come to testing of this hypothesis, so remember, this is what I'm testing, this guy here, this is what I'm testing now. If I did not make a hypothesis, then that defeats the question of hypothesis testing, because anyone should ask, what hypothesis are you testing if I never made a hypothesis to begin with? So this is the hypothesis I made to begin with, that A will be greater than B. Now, when it comes to testing this hypothesis, I have to be objective. My hypothesis is not objective. It's obviously biased. It's biased because I'm saying that A is greater than B. But when I come to test the hypothesis, remember how we drew this figure? We said that this yellow part, which is how we come up with our research questions, it's okay for it to be subjective because there is no objective research question. We only have objective methods, right? Research questions are born from our own biases and prejudices, right? So they can never be objective because such thing does not exist. So we come up with a research question. Now, for the testing, we talk about the null. The null means that here we're saying there's no effects. So we're saying that A is equal to B, which is the same thing as saying A minus B equals 0, which is the same way of saying that there is no difference between A and B, right? All of these are the words, the null hypothesis. Null simply means empty, nothing. Think of the word null. It's related to nothing, right? So null means there's nothing happening there. Now, the alternative hypothesis means that A minus is just the opposite of this. That means A is not equal to B, or A minus B is not equal to 0, or there is no difference or there's a difference. So this is the alternative now. There is a difference between A and B. Now, take note that I said there is a difference. Take note of what I did not say. I did not say that A will be greater than B. I did not say that A will be less than B. Right? I didn't say any of these things. I said that the null hypothesis is that there will be no difference, which is the same thing as saying that A equals B or A minus B is 0, or that there's no difference between A and B. My alternative is also neutral. It is by no means biased. So remember we said this part, everything after this has to be objective. You see the objectivity here because this is not objective. The hypothesis itself, obviously it's biased. That's my own thinking. That's my educated guess. But then when I'm testing the hypothesis, I'm saying that everything has to be objective. I'm saying my alternative is that there will be a difference. Now, that difference, is it that A is greater than B? I don't know. So it could be that A is greater than B, or it could be that B is greater than A. I've opened my mind to any of these possibilities happening. I am not while I believe that A will be greater than B, I'm not married to this hypothesis. I'm willing to accept anything that comes. This is what we mean when we say you're doing a two-sided hypothesis, right? You mean that you are accepting that the results can go to the left or that can go to the right, right? You are willing to accept anything. Now, when we test hypothesis, we are interested in three things that could result in any of the results that we see. Because anything we see in this under the sun can be explained by one of three things. It could be the truth, it could be chance, it could be bias. These three things explain anything in the world. So the question is, obviously, we want the truth. That's what we want to see, the truth. Then now we have to find a way of dealing with these two guys, chance and bias. Now the question is, how do we deal with chance? Well, we deal with chance by p-values, right? That is why p-values were created. So it's possible that I might see a result that shows that A is greater than B. But the question is that, how am I sure that that is not just because of chance? I mean, anything can happen by chance. How am I sure that the result that I found here is not due to chance? Well, that is where p-values come in, right? So when you see a p-value of, let's say, 0.001, what we are saying is the shortened version of it, the simplified version of this is that the probability that this difference that we're seeing is due to chance is 0.001. That's what we're saying in a very, very simplified manner. So remember that we said there are three things that explain everything in the universe: truth, chance, and bias. We want the truth, but we have to find a way of controlling for chance, and we have to control for bias, right? We control for chance with p-values. So p-value is saying that, well, if indeed there's no difference between these two guys, well, the probability of seeing this result I have seen is 0.0001. I'm like, oh, okay, well, then it's so small that we have to conclude that it's no chance, that indeed there is a difference. That's how we control for chance. We control for bias through a whole lot of, that's why you do regression. When you do regression, you're trying to control for bias, right? So when you do regression with a p-value, you're controlling for both chance and bias. In a nutshell, that's what statistical testing is doing, or hypothesis testing. But hypothesis testing implies that we first of all made a hypothesis, which was this. And this hypothesis came with all our biases and everything. And we will now want to test that hypothesis, right? The hypothesis, of course, can be subjective. In fact, let me put this in red. So the moral of the story is that our research questions, our hypotheses, always come from a place of bias and our subjectivity. But what we demand is that when we test for them, everything from the methodology should be objective. I hope that explains, at least to some level, the question you had.
Thanks, Prof. Yes, Dr. T. Are you still here?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, moderator and presenter, Prof. Chart presentation where more than 500 participants are attending. Thank you for that. My question is, actually you responded partially regarding the AI using either properly citing AI notes to use on one's scientific purpose, like a thesis. Is it possible to use without using or modifying or humanizing the contents of AI into one's scientific purpose, even though the university allows or disallows using AI? Thank you.
Okay, so I think it's very helpful to read the, I was just going to read COPE's guidelines, so that I think I will answer a lot of COPE position statements. I think let's see. Well, I'll just look for it. So let's look at this. So our let's see. I'm looking for the specific PDF. So I think it would be very helpful, right, to read. This is quite a lengthy read, so we're not going to read through it. But the point is that, one, there's nothing inherently wrong with or unethical with AI. What would be inherently unethical is using AI and then saying, "Oh, I never used it," right? So that would now definitely be unethical because you obviously used it, So what the problems we're trying to solve are not issues of, oh, let's forge AI use so that it's not going to be apparent that somebody used it. If an individual is concerned about AI use, then it's simple. They don't have to use it. It's not a requirement that use AI. In fact, the AI toolkit is just a very, very tiny part of the whole Chisquares platform, right? So the bottom line, what I'm trying to say is that at the end of the day, it's up to investigators or users to determine whether they want to use AI to what extent they want to use AI. There's no cutoff in the scientific community that says this is the level of AI that you must use, and beyond that, it's illegal. There's no such thing. It's ultimately left to you, and AI is just a tool that is meant to increase our productivity. And at Chi-Squares, we are not interested, or we'll never build a tool that says, oh, let's forge it. Because in fact, some platform goes all the way to say we're going to throw some errors into the work, some typos to make it look as if it's written by a human. I will find that quite ridiculous, and that's not, that's because that's not our mission. That's not what we're trying to solve. So at the end of the day, it's left to individual users to decide where they want to use AI or not, and any such issues. But knowing fully well that there's nothing wrong or unethical about AI use. All right, next question, please.
Skynet.
Okay. Okay, good evening, Prof. Yeah, and so I mean, like during my undergraduate, I've been used to basically I was only able to experience how to use descriptive statistics, and I've been seeing further research on inferential statistics. So then I was listening to you when you were talking about hypothesis, because I was being told that it's not necessary that we have hypothesis in our research. But then I've always wondered, if there's no hypothesis, then how do I test? How do I show in my test that, okay, though I'm not writing out the hypothesis, but then I'm testing the hypothesis. Like I would like to advance more than majorly descriptive. I would love to use more of hypothesis. Like, could you recommend articles that I could read so that I could have more further idea on how to the testing of the hypothesis? And then just like you showed, I was watching what you showed us. We don't have to state it, but then we could test it. Could you recommend more articles that we could use as a guideline or something?
Okay. So let me first of all quickly clarify. If you're a student, this does not apply to you. You should always write it out explicitly, right? If you're please always because you need to develop that practice and understand it clearly before you come to the point where you say, I can always explain. If you write it out explicitly, no journal is going to say remove it. Right, it's not a requirement. As an editor, I'm not going to say, if somebody said our null hypothesis was so, I'm like, oh, great. This shows this. It's good practice, right? So you should first of all develop the habit of if you're a student, you should always write it out. That would be my recommendation, and especially if it's on your thesis or your dissertation. Oh, absolutely, you must write it. Right, the null hypothesis is this. The alternative hypothesis is this. Right. So make it a practice so that you begin to think in terms of null and alternative, and then as far as books, there's really it's any good statistics textbook, Stat 101 would provide a lot of details into that. But try and read a lot of scientific literature, like find your favorite journal and see how they write. Look for a good journal, obviously. That does good science, and see how they read. I mean, any journal that does good work would be a good learning material for you. And then you can see how people frame things, and you can see also individual preferences, right? How people write and how people express their objectives or their hypotheses. Of course, there's room for individual flair and individual personality in scientific writing as well. And you can see that very well expressed in how people write too. But you should start by, first of all, writing explicitly your hypothesis when you are a student, and then as you advance in your career, you can then choose which rules you want to break.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah.
Prof, can you share the link to the articles, Cope and the other one?
Okay, sure. So I think they've updated this. So maybe let me just go to the first position statement. Right, any other questions? I'm just going to share this, and then you guys can go and figure out which part of,
Yes, please.
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity. Good evening, Prof. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hafsat. I'm calling from Nigeria. My question is, there's this research I'm writing, and I have 4 objectives. So I have 2 questions here. Do I have to have research questions for all the 4 objectives? And also, the second question is, do I also have to generate hypotheses for all the objectives?
Okay. So one paper should have 1 research question. So simple, right? So now we'll talk about TMQ. When you have 4 questions in 1 paper, that's too much. 1 question. So think of it simply: 1 paper, 1 question. The paper sought to answer this 1 question. Now, having 4 objectives is a tad too much. So you can try and for descriptive work, which it's likely what you might be doing, try to keep it to 2 to 3 aims in that paper. You don't need to write out, this is the hypothesis for aim 1, this is the hypothesis for aim 2, and so on and so forth. But you need to think about it. So some of these things we're talking about are not necessarily required for you to write them down on paper, but it's to help you think. Because the question is, if you don't even know the hypothesis for where you are taking the paper, how then are you going to explore the paper? Because the hypothesis is that's what you're exploring in the paper. So when you say I have aims 1, 2, and 3, it means that these are the directions I want to take the paper to. So the question then is, what are you think? What are your thoughts? So when you say you don't have any hypothesis on the aims, it means that you have no. It's like you're blind. You're flying blind. You have no idea of what you're doing. You should have an idea of what you're doing, and that idea is what is expressed as your hypothesis for where you think, right? So that's what we're saying. So none of this means you have to write down and say, "Oh, this is the hypothesis for aim 1, and this is the hypothesis for..." No. But you need to at least think about it, because that is what then drives the methodology. The research question drives the hypothesis drives the methodology. So the question is, if you don't have a research question and you don't have a hypothesis, what then is driving your methodology? Like, are you just pulling out numbers from thin air, or how exactly are you doing it? So the methods are a function of the research question and the hypothesis. If you don't have a hypothesis, then what are you testing exactly? I hope that is clear. So keep 1 question for your whole paper. Don't have too many objectives or aims. Keep them moderate. It's okay to have 1 objective, 1 research question, and 2 aims. That's fine. But then there should be a clear, coherent thought to what you're doing, and that is what we mean by the hypothesis. Like, where am I going with this paper? Otherwise, when somebody asks you questions about your paper, you seem to be completely lost because you actually have not thought about it clearly. And it's evident that you've not thought about it because you have no clear sense of what you are even hypothesizing that the paper might say. I hope that answers your question.
Prof?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm referring to Prof. Hamidou. Amadou, sorry.
Thank you very much, Prof, for this presentation. Thank you, Longile. My question is regarding the hypothesis. I just want to confirm, more especially in terms of types of research. Do all forms of research necessarily have to have a hypothesis? That's my first question. Yes, sir. Yes, Prof. Then the second question is regarding the last question that I was asked. I didn't really get clearly. Did you say one hypothesis for one paper, and if you have multiple objectives, multiple research questions? I didn't get exactly what you explained there. I don't know if you can please take it again. Thank you very much, Prof.
One paper, one question, one paper. So a research question should drive one single paper. If you have multiple research questions, then this should be explored in different manuscripts. Now, if your questions are so tiny, then maybe you can collapse them into one larger coherent question and answer in your research paper. But in general, if you have one well-formed question, then that should be one paper. Now, you can have a couple of aims in each paper. It's not as if it's one aim, one paper, because the aim simply tells you the direction of a paper. In a typical manuscript, for example, you will have 4 tables. Table 1 will tell you about the characteristics of a study population. Table 2 might tell you like descriptive analysis of the key outcomes of interest. So maybe you have prevalence of so and so indicators. Table 3 will typically tell you some multivariable analysis, right? Adjusting for certain confounders. Table 4 might be some sensitivity analysis. Well, think of it as each of the main tables carries the results for some aim that you wanted to articulate. Because for every aim you expressed, then you want to obviously provide a methodology for it. You want to provide a result for it. Now, the ultimate rule of thumb is that there's no rule of thumb. All of these things are simply just guidances to provide some structure. So at the end of the day, however you formulate it, well, that's fine. There's no requirement that these are not a must do, but these are just general structures to provide you with guidance and structure for the whole thing. For the second part of your question, sorry, hold on a minute. For the second part of the question, which was, must all research questions carry objectives or hypotheses?
You're muted, Prof. Okay, just wait.
Okay, so the second part of the question was, must every research question have a hypothesis, depending on the discipline? Well, disciplines vary in terms of what they call aims. A discipline might call as an aim what other people call objectives. And at the end of the day, these semantics really do not matter, right? What matters is this research question you've asked. Are you exploring it in a way that is free of bias and that is free of threats to internal and external validity, right? Whatever you call it, whether you call it objectives, aims, or whatever, right? Is it done in the right way? So we really want to make sure that we don't dwell too much on semantics and miss the forest for the trees. The issue is the methodological rigor we bring to the issue, not whatever we call it, right? So that is, at the end of the day, that's the crux of the issue, that whatever research question we ask, however we're calling the different parts of it, how have we explored it? Have we made sure that there are, we've addressed the core threats to validity, confounding bias, selection bias, measurement bias? How have they been addressed? Have they been, properly addressed? Have we addressed threats to, chance findings? How have we done so? At the end of the day, if we've done all of those things, well, you can call it whatever you want. Then that's a matter of personal preference, or maybe the discipline-specific preferences. But the crux of it is that, have they given us the truth? Because remember, everything can be explained by truth, chance, and bias. What we want is the truth. And whatever you call the processes in there, those are just secondary importance.
Prof, what happened to your sound?
You can hear me?
Not too well. It's not clear.
I'm not sure. Maybe that's a signal that is in the class.
Okay, maybe it's me. Someone says they can hear you. I can hear you, but it's not clear. It's not the same as it was before you We're disconnected. Okay, it's mine, I guess. Okay. All right. Thank you everyone for that. Maybe I was going to use that as an excuse to end the session, but okay, we can continue. Ejike, please unmute. Dr. Abdullahi, do you still want to say something, or is that an old hand? Okay. If you want to say something, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Prof.
See if there's
Thank you,
anything.
Yes, I just needed clarification. It's something I once had a professor saying that if you are doing a descriptive statistic, a descriptive research, that you don't necessarily need to have a hypothesis. So that's what I wanted a clarification for. I do have some forms of research in which you specifically expect to have a hypothesis, and others you don't expect to have a hypothesis.
So when you set out to do this, okay, let's discuss about this, right? When you set out to do this work, what were you thinking? What did you think you'll find? Whatever it was.
Yes, it was supposed to be like a study on the prevalence, to identify the prevalence of a particular finding, observation in the population. So I was thinking, okay, what is the prevalence of invasive streptococcal infection in the HIV population in this facility? So I was thinking, if it's such a research, will I need to put forward a hypothesis? If it's not, if it's more of a descriptive study.
So this prevalence we're talking about, right? In this population, do we expect to see differences in the population, or do you expect that the prevalence will be homogeneous?
No, we're not actually subdividing them into subpopulations. It was just to find out what was the how common it was in that population.
So are you telling me that you wanted to just report the study was just saying prevalence is 25%, full stop, end of story?
Yes, more or less, like it was trying to show what is the pattern of that observation in this population. So I was not sure.
So you introduce a new word now, pattern, right?
Yes.
Pattern means there's a pattern. So you are obviously implicitly saying that you expect to see a pattern.
Yes.
So the hypothesis could be that we expect to see subgroup differences in prevalence of X among the population, right? With prevalence being higher among so-and-so groups because of so-and-so factors. That is a hypothesis, which you are going to test later. That's why you do. So the question is, if you're doing tests later on, did you do tests like chi-square test or any test of differences in your analysis?
No, actually, no, I've not actually gone ahead to that point yet.
Okay.
I'm still at the point of framing the research question.
Okay. So my point is this: the point I'm trying to make is, if you end up at the end of the day saying we tested for differences, right? We tested for differences in the prevalence of X by gender, by race, by whatever. The question is, why are you testing it? Why are you performing a hypothesis test? When you do a hypothesis test without a hypothesis, surely that sounds comical, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
It's like you said you're testing a hypothesis, but you also told me that you have no hypothesis. So what hypothesis are you testing then? So if you're not going to test anything, so it's fine, right? You can say, oh, I just had prevalence of 25%, end of story. That was all the whole paper. But should I see that in your paper, you end up saying, oh, we compare differences? That means you are explicitly testing the hypothesis, right? One of the requirements for, the strobe criteria Scope criteria is what guides research, observational research. One of the things we're also very careful about with observational data is indiscriminate testing of results, which means that people just grab the results, right? And then they're looking for a p-value that is significant. So they start running all manner of tests. That is obviously bad. It results in a high risk of type 1 error, which is just a fishing expedition. So how do we prevent that? We say that all hypotheses, you must have, a priori declaration or hypothesis of differences that you want to explore. This is what we call a hypothesis, right? You're saying, I expect to see differences in this prevalence by age, gender, and race. Now, when I am doing my testing later, and I'm testing for differences by age, gender, and race, I expect to go and compare what you said was the hypothesis with what you're doing. If you did not declare a hypothesis and now you're just running around testing everything, then we have a problem because you are just doing a fishing expedition. So the short answer to the question is yes, even descriptive statistics should have hypotheses if you plan to test the hypothesis, because doing a hypothesis test later on when you did not declare any hypothesis, that just sounds funny, because you say you're testing a hypothesis. It's like saying you are driving the car you never bought. It's like, people begin to question your sanity, right? Like you are doing driving motions, but you don't have a car. If you're going to drive, you need to have bought a car and then you are driving the car. If you're going to test hypothesis, then it assumes you have the hypothesis to test. You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes, Prof. Yes, Prof.
Okay, great.
Yes, thank you very much, Prof.
You're welcome. So, Lungi, I think we've answered all the questions.
question. Okay, there are no more hands. I didn't read a lot of questions today. Let me see. Okay. You can unmute yourself, OPO.
Yes, thank you very much, moderator and Prof, colleagues. I would like to, Prof, to expound on these two phrases of 10 commandments of data, something of data. One is about this phrase of the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Two, data cannot speak for itself until you eat it hard. What does that mean? And then lastly, I did not get it very well, Prof. How to put it very clearly, the gap of a research.
Okay. All right. So the gap in research, that's what you have to go and practice. So that we've given you all the tools to go and practice that. So that's the easy part of the answer. The other ones we're talking about is the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What we're just describing is we're saying is that when you have your results and you see results that are not significant, don't overflog the issue. So you say, let's say your hypothesis was that A will be greater than B. You tested the hypothesis and you did not see a difference. Your actual results showed there was no difference between A and B. And then in your analysis and your discussion, you're just overflogging the issue and saying, oh, there was no difference. There was no difference. It's like, well, have you considered that there could have been difference but it's possible that your study was not powered, right? And this is what we call a type 2 error. So a type 2 statistical error is when there is an actual difference in nature, but your study did not just find it because you did not have enough sample size. We always talk about the story of a guy, the boy who cried wolf. If somebody who has attended our class before should tell us the story of a boy who cried wolf, because that answers the question. For those of you who have not heard, who wants to share the story of a boy who cried wolf and tell us the type 1 and type 2 statistical errors there? Anybody? Surely there should be one
You can
person.
unmute yourselves.
Lungile, do you have any takers?
No, Prof.
Okay. Do you want to tell us a story?
I can't even hear you.
Oh,
like
really?
I can barely hear you. Yeah.
That is
Okay.
quite
May,
that's a
may,
paradox.
may I have a go?
Yes, please.
Okay. As I recall, you told us a story about the boy who was in the field and would cry wolf, and then the villagers would run in to come and help and find out that he was just joking. Such that when he now saw a real wolf devouring the sheep that he was looking after in the field, and he cried, help, help, nobody came. And the analogy was tied to type 1 and type 2 errors with respect to false positive and false negative. And if I recall, you said crying wolf is like a false positive, which is the type 1 error. And then that is, you are finding something that does not exist in your data in reality. Why the type 2 is false. The thing is there, but you did not find it in your research. Thank you, sir.
Exactly. Excellent. So in this case, the villagers failed to show up. All right. So your p-value has refused to show up. Your p-value significant 0.05 has refused to show up. So you say, oh, from the villager's perspective, there was no wolf the second time, but there was actually a wolf. They just did not show up, right? So that is what we mean by the absence of evidence. It's not evidence of absence. That the villagers did not see a wolf doesn't mean that there was no wolf. They just did not see it because they were not there. They didn't summon enough energy to go there. So you always want to keep that in mind when you analyze and interpret results, knowing that you don't want to overflog results that are, so you don't want to overflog results that are significant, especially when you did a whole bunch of tests, because it could have well been a type 1 error. And you don't want to overflog results that are not significant either, right? So just present your results and move on. Don't overflog it.
Yeah. Okay. What about the data cannot speak for itself until you eat it hard? What is it about?
Oh, no, we're not. We are discouraging you from beating the data. So please, the take-home message is not that you should beat the data. We're saying that data is susceptible to manipulation. You can manipulate. You can take any data set and make it say anything you want. At CDC, if you beat the data hard enough, it's going to confess. It's going to confess to whatever it wants it to confess, right? So that's bad practice. So part of the training is also realizing that data can be manipulated. So as researchers, we want to take everything with a big chunk of salt. That, well, it's possible that data could be manipulated, and we want to avoid manipulating data ourselves. So we don't want to beat the data too hard, right? We just want the data to confess by itself without coercion or without being flogged. So, and then when we say that data cannot speak for itself, it means that we have to communicate data. So it's not enough to just analyze data and just throw a whole bunch of tables at people and say, all right, these are the results. No. Remember that your hypothesis was subjective. Well, now it's your job to interpret the data based on the hypothesis, because remember that these results didn't just drop from the sky. The results came from your hypothesis, and your hypothesis is in your mind, right? So it's now your job for you to interpret the results and tell us what the findings are, because the findings didn't fall from space. The findings came from your hypothesis, which you tested. So just throwing the results at us and expecting us to just miraculously figure out what's possible. So the whole point of what we're trying to say is that for you to be a good researcher, you must be able to translate the results to your audience. Can we mute ourselves, please? There's a background noise. All right, Lungile, I believe we've answered all the questions, unless there are any further ones.
Yes, sir. It seems so.
Okay. Well, it was nice meeting all of you again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next session next Friday.
Hello, Prof.
Yes.
Hello, sir. Good evening, sir.
I will post the slides on our link.
Okay. Sorry, I just want to quickly ask a question regarding my research question. Can I go ahead, sir?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm working on